What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving back into deck building for beginners, talking about Control today, the third archetype in MTG Arena. Control is a pretty interesting archetype in the sense that it is a deck that is trying to play the game slow. We're trying to get board control overall, whether we're playing disruptive spells or removal spells in the early game, so that we can kind of take over the game and use our mana to our advantage. This can be done in many multitudes of ways. Typically, when a lot of players think Control in MTG, they usually think something that plays blue, as blue is the color in MTG that plays majority of the counter spells that exist. And then typically, depending on the format you're playing in, you may need to splash another color. So I would say if we're playing in standard, the versions of Control you would see would either be white-blue or blue-black, so either Azorius or Dimir. And, though there is currently like a Control deck that exists that is mono-blue, which is the mono-blue tempo deck, I would say that's probably more in the line of like an aggro-ish kind of Control deck, which is not 100% pure Control. So in today's video, we're just be diving into kind of what you would want to do if you want to build Control when it came to deck building. With that being said, let's just dive in and let's take a look at it. So the first and foremost thing, like we do in all the videos that I've done so far on this, we'll switch it to standard just because that is the easiest format to really dive into, especially as a new player, as it does have the smaller overall card pool that you have to collect cards in. And the other thing that I would suggest here, because we are going to be playing budget, is I'm actually probably going to go more towards the Dimir Control, just because playing Azorius Control or blue-white Control is a little tougher, just that some of the removal spells and the big spells that white plays are on the more expensive side, meaning that they're rares and or mythics. There are some cards that are in the common and uncommon slot, though I would say you are going to struggle against some of the more aggressive decks if you don't have any sort of spot removal spell. And therefore, like I said, I do think playing Dimir is going to be the better option as a budget player. So what we'll do here is we'll just do what we normally do. We'll filter out to blue and black. Another thing that I'll probably I'll do first is I'm just going to type in the word counter, because this is probably the main spells that we're going to want in the deck, and kind of add those into our deck as we kind of build it out here. So, the first and foremost spell I do think that's going to be definitely very valuable for us when it comes to counter spells is probably, say, something like a Make Disappear. This is a great card currently in standard in the fact that it's a 2-mana counter spell unless its controller pays 2. If we have a creature on the battlefield that has power 1 or greater, we can sacrifice it and Make Disappear and make an additional copy. It's a cheap counter spell. It does a lot for not a ton of mana, so I do think we'll add in a couple copies of this card. Another card that I do think is pretty good as well for counter spells is going to be Urtai Scorn. This is going to be one of those cards that is just a straight up 3-mana counter spell, though if our opponent decides to cast a second spell during their turn, we can actually pay 1 less and make it only a 2-mana counter spell that targets any spell, so this is definitely also very good. So we'll add a couple of copies of that. The other thing when it comes to playing Control decks, it's kind of having a good understanding of the meta. Typically, if you're going to be playing in best of 1 meta, there are going to be a lot of decks that play a bunch of creatures. And probably the best way to eliminate those creatures from actually hitting the battlefield is, say, something like an Essence Scatter. Though the downside is if we do get matched up against a deck that doesn't play Essence Scatter, this card becomes essentially useless. But this is a great 2-mana counter target creature spell, so adding a couple of those are pretty good as well. Another card that's going to become very good because we are on the value side of things is the fact... Another card that's going to become very good because we are on the budget side of things is kind of a little bit more of an expensive counter spell, but is actually an overall great counter spell in the fact that Devious Cover-Up is really good. It counter targets spell for 4 mana. If the spell is countered this way, it gets exiled instead of put into the graveyard, so just in case your opponent plays any way of recurring said spell, or the spell has an activated ability if it's in the graveyard. And the other upside benefit here is that we get to shuffle up to 4 cards from our graveyard into our library. So the reason why this makes it such a great spell for our deck is allows a lot of our spells that we may cast throughout the game, be able to be replayed and added back into our deck. So it allows us to kind of grind games out to kind of get to where we need to. So we'll add a couple of copies of this. Maybe we may go up to 3 or copies, depending on how we think things are going. But I do think this is definitely a good place to start. And as we look at our deck, we have 2 Essence Scatters, 2 Make Disappears, 2 Urtais, and 2 Devious Cover-Ups. It's one of those things that I may look at Make Disappear. If we don't play a ton of creatures, it may not be as good. So maybe that's something where I maybe put like something in like a negate. Or maybe look at just another counter spell like a Syncopate here, where we can counter target spell unless its controller pays X. And the X is anything that we can pay. And then if the spell was countered this way, we get to exile it, which is definitely not that bad. Another unique creature that actually I kind of just missed is this Mirror Shell Crab. It's a 5/7 crab with Ward of 3, meaning that if they target with a spell, if it's out on the battlefield as a creature, they have to pay 3 or that spell is countered. The other benefit here is that we can discard it for 3 mana, play its channel ability, which means this ability can't be countered itself, and we can counter target spell or ability unless the controller pays 3. So not just spells this card can hit if your opponent has like an activated ability or some sort of trigger ability, even a planeswalker ability. They'll have to pay 3 additional in order to play that spell, and if they can't, they'll counter it. So I actually think we're going to add a couple Mirror Shell Crabs for the time being, and this could become the deck's like big creature if that's what we want to do when it comes to playing spells. The thing, as much as cards came up in black for counters, that's more so it's talking about putting +1/+1 counters on things. It's not actually put in any counter. There's no counter magic in blue. If we look at blue-black, there's not much here either. In the budget side, there are rares and mythics in blue-black, but not in the way that there is in the other colors that would exist. As I was saying, like Azorius is typically usually the more common, but because we are on a budget, it's a lot easier for us to be playing this style of counter magic. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this out, and we're going to just look at removal, just because I do think that's going to be the other way that we're going to be able to do other way of kind of counter out what our opponent's doing. I do think because the format is a little bit on the aggressive side, a card like Cut Down being relatively on the cheap side, being only 1 mana is definitely very good. Probably just go with 4 for now, just because I do think, it's a good card to have in the early game because it interacts very well with a lot of creatures that your opponent may cast. Another card is going to be Infernal Grasp. This is like the standard 2-drop destroy target creature spell for 2 mana, though we do take some life points if we do decide to cast it, if we kill a creature with it. As we kind of look, through, there's not much else I would say in this that we could probably do. I mean, if we think that, there are a lot of planeswalkers that we can hit, we can do Hero's Downfall. Another card that we could play is, if I probably unfilter and probably go to black. It's not really a destroy spell. It's like a damage spell. It's probably for 2 mana, possibly 3 mana with its cleave ability. Where is it? Parasitic Grasp is a pretty interesting card here. It's a 2 mana, deal 3 damage to target human. You gain 3 life. If we cleave it, which means we pay 1 additional mana instead of its normal cost, we replace the word human and it gets removed, and we can target any creature, which is not a bad card. Maybe we'll play it if we're lacking some cards, but I do think this is definitely another good spot to start in. And I'm just going to double check to make sure there are no like gold cards, meaning multicolor cards that would make sense for our deck that, could work in what we're trying to do here. Tainted Indulgence is an interesting card. We draw 2 cards and discard a card unless there are 5 or more mana values among cards in our graveyard. So it's a draw 2 for 2, which isn't too bad. Could be something that we could splash if we think we need some card draw. We got Vol here, Voldalian Desecrator, 2 mana, 1/2. Draw a card, discard a card. If we discard an instant or sorcery card this way, each opponent loses 1 life. We gain 1 life. And we can tap 2, sacrifice it, and we may cast instant or sorcery card from our graveyard this turn. If we put into the graveyard, exile instead. Activate only as a sorcery. That's, not great because, if you have counter spells in your graveyard, we probably aren't going to be able to recast it. Rona Shieldred's Faithful, 4 mana, 3/4. That whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life. And then we can cast Rona's Shieldred's Faithful from our graveyard by discarding 2 cards in addition to playing their other costs. So this actually is not a bad card, just because she'll kind of drain our opponent slowly throughout the game if we can get her out on curve. And I think I'm going to go with 2 copies. We'll go with 3 copies because she is legendary. You can only have 1 of her out, so you don't want to draw a bunch of them. Maybe we'll cut down on some Mirror Shell Crabs. We'll do 3 and 3, just because I do think we're in a good spot there. The one thing that we're also missing that we may want to play is maybe some sort of bounce spell is a possibility. We need some sort of way maybe to draw some spells. That's also another possibility. We don't really have a lot of ways to draw spells, so let's do a draw in the search box and kind of see what comes up, and we'll turn off the gold border. Blue is kind of the color that does have a lot of spells that do draw us cards, so that is definitely good. Consider, I don't think is kind of the card, is not the card we want to play for this deck. It's not a bad draw 1, though I don't think we want to just be throwing things into our graveyard willy-nilly kind of for the most part. As we kind of scroll through, A very common draw card that currently exists is going to be Thirst for Discovery. It's draw 3 cards at 3 mana, and we discard 2 cards unless we discard a basic land card, which we're going to probably have a fair amount of basic lands just because this is a deck that's going to, want to play a lot more lands just to make sure we're hitting our colors. So play a couple we'll probably play 3 copies of that. I really do like that card. Another card that's actually pretty unique for our control deck that, I feel like it's not bad because it eventually does become a creature and has a lot of value. It's going to be Behold the Unspeakable. Creatures you don't control get -2/-0. If you have 1 or fewer cards in our hand, we get to draw 4 cards. Otherwise, scry 2, then draw 2 cards. This is actually a really good card because I do think that Chapter 2 ability is really, really strong. And then on the 3rd chapter is we get a 0/0 flyer that gets +1/+1 for each card in our hand. So this is a card that if we have a full hand, this card is going to be relatively big. It's going to help us finish off the game. So I do think adding a few copies of that is going to be really effective for what we're trying to do here. So we'll probably do 3 for now just because it is on the more expensive side. As much as we want to cast big spells, we don't want to, tap all our mana to do so because we don't want to be vulnerable to possibly getting hit. Let's see. Let's turn this off. And let's go back to gold. And I think I'm going to add some Tainted Indulgences to the deck. Yet again, another great, draw. We'll probably balance it with some Tainted Indulgence and some Thirst for Discoveries, kind of like a 1-for-1. This one only draws 2 and makes us discard 1. This draws 3 and we have to discard 2. Both very, very good. The other thing I would say when you play control is you probably want to play 26 lands. So as much as we're at 54 out of 60, I'm going to probably aim for 26 because missing land drops, especially control, it's definitely can set you back just because we want to keep on putting lands out, therefore allowing us to cast multiple things against our opponent. And I do think not having that available is definitely going to hurt us, especially because we are so very reliant on playing our counter magic and bounce magic. So I do think the other card I'm going to add in some Rona Vortex. A great 1 mana bounce spell at instant speed. Return target creature or planeswalker we don't control to its owner's hand. If this spell was kicked, put that permanent on the bottom of the opponent's library instead. So this is definitely great in the sense that it bounces the card back in the early game, and then if we have that mana available, we can force that card on the bottom. So if there's some sort of card that we couldn't answer and they got out on the battlefield, we can just get rid of it and just throw it away. And then, unless they have some sort of way to shuffle up their library, now that card's going to be on the bottom of the library for the rest of the game. So I do think adding probably 3 copies of that's not bad as we kind of curve out pretty good. I probably just need, maybe just 1 additional counter spell. I don't think there's a bunch left that I haven't touched. Maybe we go 1 additional Urtai Scorn, just because I do think that's the most solid outside of the Devious Cover-Up for counter magic. Maybe go 1 less here. I think I probably want 3 copies of Devious Cover-Up, just because I do think that's kind of another card that I want to make sure I'm hitting, just because it allows me to get more value out of our cards. So if we don't draw it, it's kind of sets us back. Another card that I kind of always forget exists that is actually pretty good for 2 mana in blue. That's kind of like a draw spell, though we get to choose our card that we draw. It's not like a draw 2. It's you look at the top 4 of your cards of your library, you get to choose one that goes into your hand. I think it's Invoke or Impulse. Not a bad card, something I may consider as well. Maybe we, instead of having Tainted Indulgence, maybe we cut back on Tainted Indulgence and we play some Impulses. I do think that's a solid card for what it does and what we're trying to do here. Both are really good, though. So it's definitely which one do I rather play? Maybe we just go 2 with the Impulses, 2 Thirst, and then we go back to Tainted Indulgence and we do 2 of those. And now we just kind of fix our lands, and we'll say this is a pretty good deck to go with. So let's go to lands. We'll go to golds. I think this land's actually pretty good just because we can, in the late game, if we have a lot of mana, we can sacrifice it, draw a card. So we'll add in some of those. Allows us to kind of filter our mana base just because we want to make sure we're hitting double blue. We have 1 double black spell overall. So let me just kind of do it this way so I'm not blocking as much. So we're still sitting at 24 lands, but we have 2 dual lands. We have 13 and 9. We'll probably end up going 1 more of each. Another card that we probably want to add is probably a Dismal Backwater. Solid tap land that comes in the battlefield. We gain a life, also creates blue and black. That one we probably want 4 copies of because that's going to help us filter our mana. And I think I just go with 2 copies of Contaminated Aquafire. And that puts us still at 24 lands, just so I want to make sure we're hitting our dual color lands, hitting our colors for what we're trying to do here. That means we have, just on top of, 10 islands, we have 8 additional sources of hidden blue mana on top of 6 swamps. We have 8 additional sources of hidden black mana. Probably just add in 1 additional copy of each, and that would call it a day when it comes to control. So I do think for playing budget, I do think there's a lot of cards that definitely work very well. This deck could struggle just because if the opponent does have a very aggressive deck, and we just don't have a way to kind of draw through, that's where we're going to struggle. But if we can really get our engines going, keeping the battlefield clear of early turn creatures with playing things like Cut Down and Infernal Grasp, leaving mana open to play counter magic if we think our opponent's like not tapping out. Like, for example, if your opponent says go on turn 1, doesn't play anything, on turn 2 they don't play anything, it's like then you at that point you kind of shift into, well, hopefully I have counter magic in my hand, then I can interact with whatever they're going to do. It is one of those things that we're not really playing a lot of things that are going to win us the game quickly. We're just playing the long game in this sense, because a lot of our cards are going to be doing things in the later game. Starting at like turn 4, we got Rona's Shieldred's Faithful, you Behold the Unspeakable, and as well as Mirror Shell Crab, not just being a 3-mana channel counter magic, also being a 5/7 creature if we do tap it out for 7 mana. So definitely a very solid deck to probably start with when it comes to control. It's definitely going to be interesting, just because I will say the one thing that this deck does struggle with is probably going to be aggro-aggressive decks. And that's probably where you want to maybe shift things around. That's why I think having, 4 copies to Cut Down, having some Infernal Grasp, having some ways to kind of bounce things back to your opponent's hand, making them replay it, it is definitely vital to really, performing very well. It's kind of crazy if you really think about it. We have, there's probably, there's 7 ways to destroy creatures. We have, let me just kind of pull cards to the side. We have this many. We have 2, 4, 7, 10, 13 ways to counter things. And then we have, cards in the middle here that are kind of like value. And then we have a couple cards that also are value, but they kind of work well. I think Rona's Shieldred's Faithful is kind of like the best card for the deck, because we're playing a lot of instances, a lot of sorceries. Downside is we're not going to be able to, take full value, because some of our things aren't. Like this guy is not a instant or sorcery, and this is an enchantment, but everything else, we'll get triggers from Rona's Shieldred's Faithful, which is definitely very good. And it's not just on our turn, it's whenever we cast it, so that's also pretty beneficial. But, I'll have a link for this deck down in the description below. I'll probably do gameplay in the near future on the deck. I just don't want these videos to be super long, just because we kind of went through and kind of explained a lot. So if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.